I did an earlier video about some funny stories in the Bible. This one's like even better because I think there's something that John wanted us to see in his gospel. He spent 3 chapters setting up a punchline. And so it's actually in some of the same stuff that we looked at before. We start in chapter 6. It's the day after feeding the 5,000. Jesus has the crowd show up and immediately calls them out and says, "You guys saw a miracle and want free bread. Like, I'm not interested." And they're like, "Well, I don't know. Show us a miracle. You should give us bread." But he uses that context to try to explain. He says, "I am the bread of life. I'm the bread that comes down from heaven." He's telling them, I am what you really need. You don't need another free meal. You need what I'm here trying to offer you. But they can't get it, and part of it's a mental block that we see in verse 42. They're saying, "Isn't this Joseph's kid? Like, we know this guy. How can he say, 'I came down from heaven'? It's like, you came from that town right over there." And so they can't see Jesus as he is because they think they already know who he is. Same thing happens in chapter 7. There was the feast in Jerusalem. Jesus didn't come to it right away. When he shows up, you find the crowd like murmuring, talking about him, all divided. Because some are saying, "Oh my gosh, have you seen these miracles Jesus does? It totally looks like what they've always taught us about the Messiah, that the blind can see, the deaf can hear, the lame can walk. This is what the Messiah is supposed to do. Is Jesus the Messiah?" But then the same mental block comes in. They're like, in verse 27, they say, "He can't be. We know where he comes from, and you're not going to know that about the Messiah," which is kind of strange. I've never been able to find a prophecy that said you wouldn't know where the Messiah came from, but it was kind of the teaching. It was almost like a legend that had developed that the Messiah is just going to pop up on the scene and do these incredible things. And so they can't receive Jesus because they're going, but I mean, he's that dude from Nazareth. Like, you're a small town kid. Like, there's nothing special about you. You can't be the Messiah. But even in that, you see in verse 31, they're going, "Yeah, but when the Messiah does come, is he going to do something more impressive than this? Like, this Jesus guy's pretty legit." In chapter 8, it takes a different turn. Here, Jesus is in a debate with a lot of the religious leaders. And he's telling them, "The reason you can't understand me is that you don't know my Father." And they're like, "Who do you think your father is?" And they're going back to him like, "Well, our father is Abraham." And he's teaching that his father is God. And they're saying, it gets ugly to the point that Jesus eventually tells them, like, "No, your father's the devil, and that's why you're trying to kill me." And they're like, "Well, you're demon possessed." But in verse 41, they say, "We're not illegitimate children." And most scholars believe that that's not just in this whole father context, but that's a straight yo mama burn that they're throwing at Jesus saying, "Dude, you have no father here. And we're pretty sure that your mom ran around with so many guys that, like, she doesn't even know who your father is, so she concocted this whole, 'Ooh, I'm a virgin' story, and no one buys it. Like, don't come at us acting all high and mighty." That's what's going on there. So still, they can't receive Jesus as he is because they are so convinced that they know exactly who he is. In chapter 9, Jesus heals a man that was born blind. That's a big deal. It actually says later in the chapter that, like, since the dawn of time, no one has heard of a man opening the eyes of one born blind. And so, but Jesus did it on the Sabbath. And so the religious people get all upset about it. And I don't know if they couldn't find Jesus or what, but they bring in the guy who was healed and they're grilling him like he did something wrong. They keep questioning him back from him, like, "Are you sure you were really blind?" And they ask his parents, and it finally comes down, and the guy's saying, "Look, I've told you and told you. Why do you want me to tell you again? Are you trying to become Jesus' disciples?" And they get so mad, and they're like, "No, we are Moses' disciples because we know God spoke to Moses. We don't know where this guy even comes from." And I think that guy connected the dots because verse 30, he goes, "Well, isn't that strange? Here's a guy that you don't know where he came from, and yet he opened my eyes. Here's a guy who is totally fitting everything that you have taught us about the Messiah." Like, he's implying this part. And it's like, "You told us that the Messiah would do these miracles, and you told us that the Messiah would be like, oh, wouldn't know where he comes from. And you just told me you don't know where he comes from, and clearly he opened my eyes." And so they get mad and kick the guy out. But what you have here is it's just this thing that still goes on every single day. that people are too familiar. They think they already know the truth about Jesus, and so they can't receive Jesus for who he really is. And we have that with Jesus. You have that with Christianity. People think they know what Christianity stands for, what it's all about, and so they aren't even interested in giving it a shot. People think they know what the Bible says, and so they never actually read it. And that's why I will never stop banging this drum of read it for yourself. God gave you a brain and he wants you to use it. The Bible will explain itself. Jesus will happily introduce himself and explain himself to you if you will simply let him. And we are so over familiar with things. We get information, we get tidbits from people. You may be getting it from me right now, but getting someone else's opinion about something is not the same as getting the facts from the source. And that's why you need to read the Bible yourself, and it's totally worth doing. And like, it's got funny stories and fun stuff in it as long as you can look and see that these are people and this is what's going on. But don't let your familiarity and this preconceived notion of what it stands for stop you from getting into it yourself and seeing what it really says.